I think we're
Bonus
gonna do this as a
episode.
bonus episode. Yeah, we're gonna do this as a bonus episode, which we're probably. I'm happy to push this live almost immediately, whenever you're ready, so we can kind of have this conversation. So, context: I recently did a workshop around redefining simplicity, and discussed like it was all based on the philosophy of the constraints-led approach, complexity theory, emergence, and all of these concepts. And someone wonderfully asked, where did they go to find the research? And I have literally just gone, Danny, where do we go? Because I know what I looked for, and I was sent a lot of sports psychology heavy stuff, which, well, it was
It wasn't sports psychology, it was skill acquisition,
skill
which,
acquisition. So it was very much focused in that area. So I think what we're going to try and do is bring those ideas here to give people a primer of what it looks like. I literally just said before we hit record that I feel like I'm very much a beginner in this, and Danny laughed at me and went, no. So we will do our best to kind of introduce the concepts and just see where this conversation goes.
yeah, what I can do is, because this will be on YouTube as well, is I'll link lots of things in the description, but because of the environment that ecological dynamics is currently in, it's very heavy in skill acquisition, which is motor learning, i.e. how to throw, how to catch, how to do things in sport, and is also built on something called ecological psychology, which is very theoretically dense.
Yeah.
So there's no real easy way to jump in to the stuff that's currently written. There is a book I'm currently reading, which I think is a nice introduction, because I mean that's the name of the book, Introduction to Ecological Psychology, but it is a textbook.
Yeah. So it's very much heavy, and it's like
It's
it's not something you can read in 5 minutes.
no,
And you'll
it's
have more questions than answers.
definitely.
Which I think that might be a good place to start. Like when you start reading this stuff, you'll have more questions than answers. And like my experience from learning it, for context, Danny has done this for a far longer time than myself, wouldn't you say?
Yeah, I
You
would
were
say,
exposed to it.
yeah, to give context, my undergraduate degree was in sports coaching. I was exposed to the constraints-led approach to coaching in my first year, my first term, but I didn't know it was ecological dynamics. I didn't know it was ecological psychology. I didn't know anything about that. It was just, here's a way of coaching sport. I didn't really grasp that ecological dynamics was a thing until my first year on my postgraduate. So that's like 3 years later. And then I still didn't understand how ecological dynamics had anything to do with perception until the first year after my graduation of my master's. So I did 5 years of this stuff before I even knew what it was. And since then, I've done another 3 years. So I would argue I've been exposed to the ideas and the philosophy, the values, and how to apply it into practice for 7, 8 years. But
Yeah.
actually being able to talk about and explain these concepts, probably 2, maybe 3 years.
Yeah. And my context, because context is important. I love how meta this episode is becoming already.
Yes.
Like my context is I I knew what I was doing, the things that we're going to talk about, but had no idea what they were.
Mhm.
I think you explained it pretty well. It's like I have got a very like my depth of knowledge. I had a very high depth in one area, and then I didn't have any scaffolding on the left and right, so it was very much unstable and fell down because I didn't know the words. I didn't have the evidence to back it up and the information to actually go yes and have that almost like the confidence in what I was saying.
Yeah.
um
The reason I think that this context is important is because when people start looking at this stuff, it can get very overwhelming very quickly, and it can also be very exciting.
yes.
And you can want to dive really deep really quickly. And one of the first things I actually said to you with the Becoming a Sports Coach book is don't go and explore, just read the book. And And that's how I would approach any of the sources that I link in the description. I'll probably link a podcast, which again is very heavy. Scale acquisition podcast, very heavy. Don't try and understand it all. Just take something, take a word or a sentence, be like, that's cool. How can I think about that?
What would probably be good is, should we talk about some of the concepts and our experience of those concepts, our perception? I think let's expand on what I actually touched in my workshop. So
I was going to say you lead, because I don't know what you spoke about.
Yeah, so let's kind of start with one concept from complexity theory, which is emergence, which might be a good place to kind of begin our adventure as we kind of emerge into the discussion. Sorry, I can't help myself.
You can't help yourself, can you?
No, I can't, because it's fun. So I was talking about emergence from the perspective or the context or the environment of redefining simplicity. And what I meant by that is taking the word simplicity and creating your own interpretation, building an environment around that, and expanding the constraints that have been naturally put on simplicity. One of the constraints that I see a lot is that simplicity is always less and is always minimalism, but that is one interpretation of that word. And so what I introduced into my workshop was the idea that there are other interpretations of simplicity, and what is and there are multiple. Simplicity isn't static. It is very much like, this is an idea that, depending on the environment that you're in, other ideas emerge or come forth, or as you gain awareness, and awareness not being the traditional view of like, let me sit and meditate for 3 hours. It's seeing what's happening and having those feedback loops. Something happens, you're like, this sucks. I hate my entire experience. That is a feedback loop, which allows you to perceive, create constraints, notice affordances, and all of that kind of happens through there. Would you agree in my...
Does it make sense? Yes. Would that be beginner friendly? I don't think so.
No, probably not, but I get very excited very quickly.
Yeah, you've added lots of jargon in straight away. So to pick it up, to pick it apart a bit, what is a system? A system is a collection of parts.
Yeah.
Simply put,
things that come together.
So I'm going to use an analogy. I'm going to use a phone, because everyone has a phone.
I use that analogy. I love how well we
well, it's the same analogy that I used in my video. That's very dense. So the phone is a system, and inside the phone there are parts that build up the system. But inside the phone there is a microchip, which is a part of the phone system, but it's also a system in itself, because there are things inside the microchip. And the same thing with a SIM card. Same thing with every part of the phone is a system. And inside the system, there are other parts. And that is system inside of a system inside of a system. And that continues. Where it becomes complex is when those parts start to interact in a different way. So a phone is not a complex system, because it does what it's supposed to do. When you take nature as an example, I'm going to use birds. There is, for those that are unfamiliar, you can see birds or ants or any animal really. When they group up together, there's a group of ants or a group of birds flying around. That is a system built up of parts, being the birds or the organisms. But they are autonomous, because each bird is its own thing. It's its own system. So it's still a system inside of a system, but the bird can go where it wants. The ant can go where it wants. But inside that formation, they are constrained. They are flying together. They are walking together in a straight line as an ants. But it takes energy and effort to keep that system together, because the ants may want to run off in different directions. The birds want to fly elsewhere. So that energy keeps the system together. And when you have a complex system in a dynamic environment, i.e. the world in this in this example, it takes energy to keep those systems together. And when the energy isn't enough, or the energy isn't maintained, entropy happens, i.e. the system disperses. The birds fly away, the ants go off in different directions. The phone is always going to stay together because it's not complex and it's not dynamic. So when we look at those different things, if I do get things wrong, I will probably call myself out in like the comments section, in the pinned comment, because I'm saying this off the top of my head. So when you look at these things, you can map this ecology, this organism, bird, ant, insect, and the environment, the ecosystem, the forest, the trees, the beach, organism, environment. You map that into humans. The human is the organism, and the environment, again, is the world that they live in. And that is the system that we're talking about.
Yeah.
Does that make sense to you?
Yeah, that makes perfect sense to me. And that is kind of a lot of my work in business is around systems, is around creating an environment that matches the reality of what you have. And a lot of
I think there's a misconception that could happen there. When you say creating an environment, the environment already exists.
Yes, yeah, that's very true. So the environment exists and you are in that environment. And you, in the context of business, you can influence that environment depending on what you want to happen and what you are looking to achieve, and you can constrain that environment. In other words, things such as having a tool that helps you to do X, Y, and Z. You can see that you don't enjoy this type of work, so you constrain the environment so that it allows you to not have to do that work, and you use a tool which you bring into the system. It becomes part of the system, it becomes part of the environment that you are in, and it allows you to constrain what you do, but the system still works around you. But the environment is always changing because it depends on where you are. And so as the environment changes, things happen.
So continuing on with our analogy, we'll use the ants to make things easier. The environment of the floor has things in it, objects on it. Maybe it's a root, and you can imagine this line of ants, this system line of ants is walking forwards, and there's a tree root there. Well, they can see the constraint, i.e. there is a root there, I can't walk through the root. But it also sees an affordance, because ants are actually pretty good at climbing. So the ant sees the affordance and climbs over said root. But on the way back, a leaf fell, and now there's a leaf in front of the root. So the constraint is still there, but there's an added constraint of the leaf. But the affordance is also slightly different, as they can still climb. It's still an ability they have. It's still a skill the ants have, but it's changed slightly because they need to get over the leaf. So a different constraint has been added to the environment, but the affordances of the ants lets them do that. However, if that ant doesn't have the ability to walk up, say it's a slimy wall instead, well, the affordance isn't there because they can't climb a slimy wall, which means it's a constraint they cannot get through, which means they need to find another solution. Finding another solution, maybe they, I don't know if ants can dig, maybe they dig under it, or probably they just walk around it or go elsewhere. That's where the constraints and affordances impact the organism in the environment.
Yeah.
And how the organism sees those constraints and affordances is through perception. And the perception and action are coupled.
Which is something that I also covered in the workshop.
And because perception and action is coupled in this example, they perceive the constraint and act accordingly. They don't perceive the constraint and then have to figure out what's going on and process the information. That gets very complicated when it comes to visual perception, so I'll leave a resource for that. But they don't do that inside of ecological psychology. They do what's called direct perception. They directly see the information, the tree, the leaf, the slimy wall. They directly see it and they go, here's the affordance, here's the constraint. I can't climb that, or I can climb that. I'm going to do that thing. Inside of a traditional approach, they see the constraint. It's not called a constraint. They see the barrier and they start thinking, how do I find a solution to this? What is the solution to this? What information do I have from prior experiences that can help me educate this new experience? We're not saying that's wrong. We're just saying it's a different perspective. because the traditional approach is suggesting you're perceiving something indirectly because there's not enough information in the environment to actually find a solution. But what ecological psychology is saying is actually there is. You see the constraint or the affordance and you don't walk up the wall. Like as a human, I can see a wall. The constraint is the wall. I can't walk through it, so I'm not going to. If, however, I see a hammer, I know the affordance of a hammer. I hit said wall, make a hole, I go through it. And that is, I assume, what you were talking about inside of your talk, by using the affordances in your environment to bring a part, the hammer, into the system of the organism me and the object hammer now becomes a system, because the hammer is, you can use it, and then I put the hammer down, and now it dissipates into the individual parts, the organism and the hammer. And you're using those things in the environment to move yourself forwards, to get over that barrier.
And a bit of a meta moment here. Like, one, the workshop is an affordance that you now have because I've shared these ideas, philosophies, concepts with you, meaning what you see is changed in some way, and that affords other actions. It allows you to take a different action. The plan with redefining simplicity was around giving you other options, I suppose. I'm trying to avoid using complicated language. I'm trying to avoid using that, but it gives you different affordances because you're like, okay, cool. So I perceive simplicity as less, but this isn't working and I'm actually not getting what I need. So I feel overwhelmed. And so there is an action to be taken, which was talking about those loops that I mentioned earlier of like,
I think putting it into practice, to not correct you, but to alter your language a little bit. When it comes to perceiving affordances, you don't perceive a different or another.
No, thank you.
You're still perceiving the same affordances. It's just you're attuning your focus. So you're focusing on something more than something else. So when I see a wall, I can do lots of things. I have lots of affordances. I can punch the wall, I can kick the wall, I can elbow the wall, I can do lots of things with the wall, but none of those things, from my affordance understanding, is actually going to get to the right solution. I can try those things, and I have tried those things, and those affordances don't work, which means I need to try something else. What other affordances are there? I look around, I see the hammer, I'm going to attune my focus on the hammer. Now, how can I develop this skill to get through said wall? And that's where I think putting it into action, there is nothing new to do when it comes to actually living, because we've been doing this all of our lives. If ecological psychology is correct, again, I'm not saying it's right. I'm just saying this is the perspective. There's nothing new to look at. You don't look at something and go, oh, I now perceive a different affordance. No.
Yeah.
But what you can do, and this is how I've applied it, is when I look at an environment, I think instead of going, okay, I have an issue, how do I find a solution to the issue? This may sound very semantical. I look at it and go, okay, what is the information that I have? Because I've directly interpreted, perceived the information. I know there is a wall. I know all of the stuff in my room. You could lay out all of the things in your room, lay out all of the constraints in the environment, and then go, okay, these are the different solutions. Which one am I going to go with? And it's just troubleshooting. It's critical thinking, problem solving. There's nothing new there. Where it becomes a little bit different and a little bit new is when you start becoming your own teacher, your own coach, your own creator of the environment, and you start constraining the environment to your own benefit. And this is, to me, where the power of ecological psychology comes in for personal development and self-help, is I can look at an environment and go, okay, I have too many affordances here. I have too many distractions, to use another word. I have too many affordances in this environment. I'm going to constrain it. I'm going to add a blocker on my phone. I'm going to turn my phone off. I'm going to move books away from me. I'm going to change my environment. So those tips and tricks that you see.
Yeah, I was about to touch that. Yeah.
Those tips and tricks you see can be used through ecological language. I have too many affordances in this environment for me to stay attuned, to stay focused on what it is that I want to do. So I'm going to constrain it and remove the ability to do some of those things, remove the affordances to focus on a certain skill.
And this is kind of where often there is this kind of binary of there are productivity people and there are anti-productivity people, and that like weirdness that occurs with that is everything the productivity people are saying are not wrong, but my interpretation is they lack the context that you would have and the context of the environment that you are in. So the affordances and constraints that exist for you. And so the tips, tricks, and hacks are in a bubble. The books that are written are in a bubble that is based primarily on our own perception and what we see. And so what we're talking about here and what I found exciting from a personal development perspective and building my business and all of the stuff was like harnessing is not quite the right word, but it's the best way I can describe it, of like harnessing that perspective of like, okay, cool. So this is what I see. This is what exists. What action am I going to take? And what options are available?
I think something worth talking about as well, very briefly, is when you see other people give advice, it's given from their system, their environment, their experience. So if you don't have context, then the affordance they are sharing, i.e., the tip or trick that they are sharing, may not work in your environment, i.e., the tip doesn't work for you. That's not to say the tip is bad or
Yeah.
the technique doesn't work. It's to say that the environment you're in is different from the environment they are in.
And a good example of this, I think I mentioned it in the workshop, but I'm going to mention it again here, is the idea of time blocking. It's a tip, it's a trick, it's a hack, it's a thing you can do to make you more organized and get things done and et cetera, et cetera. And for a very long time, it didn't make sense to me. It made absolutely zero sense to do that because I had the affordances I had is it lent me to be able to do lots of different things. So constraining that inside of time boxes and blocking it off made absolutely zero sense in the environment that I'm in because I don't need to be constrained in that way at that time in the environment that I'm in. However, when my environment shifted, because that is reality, like the environment that I'm in shifted to myself actually having a lot more constraints on what I do, looking after my kids, being able to do X, Y, and Z, PQRST, all of the things that I had to do differently. It meant that free-flowing system, as it will, the unconstrained system, not correct, but
Dynamic.
that's the perception. The dynamic system was too much, and I needed to bring in constraints, and I needed to bring in constraint to add that constraint of a tip, like time blocking, like using a tool, like and each of those things work, become part of the system, become a part in a system as well as a system in itself. And a lot of the productivity advice and doobery stuff that happens is very much like follow this, but why?
I think to start with, using the language in explaining situations helps. Like when I started explaining things to you, I think it helped when you started using the language and understanding the differences between constraints, affordances, the environment. And then when you were interpreting information, you could apply it to the appropriate concept, which kind of gave you a leg up because you're like, okay, all right, I see this as a constraint now, but that also means that I'm reducing this affordance. Or I see this as an affordance now. How do I constrain it so that there's only so much that I have? So using those words can be helpful. And I think the final thing that I have to say on this as a like a beginner is, from a traditional approach, there is nothing wrong with it. But the way I think of the traditional approach is, when you're perceiving something, you're perceiving a moment in time. That's the traditional approach. It looks at a moment, takes a snapshot from a camera and says, okay, what do we know about this, and how can we interpret this moving forwards?
Yeah.
Whereas the ecological approach doesn't take a snapshot, because it realizes that the world is always moving. So instead of taking a snapshot and processing the image, it looks at a video instead, because the video tells you much more. And that's how we really perceive the world. We don't just look at something straight on and go, okay, now let's look at it. We look at a video and we continually understand as the video goes on. That's how I have it in my mind.
Yeah. And also, something that I had when I first was experiencing it was like, well, duh. And it was that, well, there needs to be more. Like, is there not more? And for me, I've kind of got to a point of like, okay, cool. This is what it is. And I don't necessarily need to find more all of the time. So adding in a constraint in, I'm constraining my desire for more. And go back to what we were saying right at the beginning. When you first start looking into this stuff, add that constraint so that you're not overwhelmed as heck, because you will be, because there's so much. And every single time I look at it, I'm like, oh, that's a new thing. 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 And I think I had a tendency to want to rush forward. And as I kind of have slowed down my not slowing down my understanding, but just taking in the environment more versus trying to get to the end. Because, as I said at the beginning, like, I still view myself as a beginner, and Daniel's reaction was to laugh and go, no, you're not. From my understanding, based on what you just said, you'll always feel like a beginner.
That's where the learning science comes into this. Inside of the traditional approach, a lot of people see it as linear. You go from beginner to intermediate to expert or advanced or whatever you want to call it. Inside of ecological psychology, it's non-linear. There is no path step by step. You develop expertise in various directions. So you're a beginner and an expert at the same time, which is where perception and action are coupled, because it's the same thing. It's not a snapshot. You don't look at it and go, you are a beginner right now. Well, actually, it's more of a big music dial of things. You're a beginner at this thing in that context, in that environment, with those affordances and constraints. But if you go into a different environment, that dial goes all the way down. Now you're an expert. And this is where people can be an expert at a skill, but a beginner at a sport. So someone could be an expert at passing a ball against a wall and getting it back to their feet, but they could be a beginner in actually playing a football match, because there are far more skills involved.
Yeah.
And you can apply that to, obviously that's a sport example because ecological dynamics is heavily influenced by skill acquisition, but you can apply that to any other environmental skill.
Yeah. Yeah. I think we covered.
I don't think we want to go any deeper.
Not yet. If you have more questions, please just put questions down below, because it's incredibly helpful and valuable, because then it helps. Well, it certainly helps me, because I'm like, okay, cool, that's a misconception I had. And that's a misconception I had. And I enjoy that in the environment, because this isn't really spoken about outside of sport. And so bringing this into whatever the heck we do is a lot of fun, and it provides a lot of, it unlocks things, is the best way I can put it.
I think you described it in a previous episode that it gives you a sense of freedom.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. It's given me a sense of freedom to explore rather than get to an end, which was always my natural way of working, which makes sense, was to always explore. But due to the constraints of what productivity and business tells us to do, and that information is like, oh no, close this in, just focus here, focus there, focus this, focus that, focus. And so that shift of like, no, let's there are times to focus, I guess, and add more constraints, as I mentioned with the productivity example of adding in that, but it's being aware or perceiving what is in the environment and going, cool, boop, I can put this in here in this environment. But when I'm out there, that's no longer useful, and I can just, it's there and it just entropies or fades away. It doesn't ever go, it's still there, but it's kind of like right on the outskirts. About to be corrected, I can feel it.
The ability, it dissipates and it does go, but it can be recreated, and the recreation is typically easier. I think a nice way to sum this up is the process, like following the process, enjoying the process of doing X thing is something spoken about a lot inside the productivity space. Ecological dynamics is about creating a practice that works in an environment. It's about creating practice environments for you to do the thing, which is process. It doesn't look at the end goal or the starting point. It focuses on the practice, on the process. And that's why I prefer ecological dynamics over information processing, because it isn't step 1 to step 2 to step 3. It's step 2 all the way around.
Yeah. That pretty much sums it up beautifully.
All right. See you in the comment section.